What's up guys, in today's tutorial we will be talking about a sound design, specifically how I do my sound design, how I get my sounds and how I put them into my records. Now, I do things a little bit differently, as I suppose every producer does. This is my specific method, so I hope you guys get something out of this. It will be a bit of a lengthy episode as there are a lot to cover in this, but it will be a lot of fun. So I'll see you guys in there. Alrighty, what's up guys? So today we are going to be talking about sound design and mainly kind of like how I go about and doing mine. I know there are a lot of kind of ways to approach sound design. This way is the most intuitive for me that I've found over the course of time. And this is one that it becomes more and more personal as we kind of go along. And as I take in different sort of processes, it definitely changes quite a lot in terms of quite frequently in terms of like how I do these and how I kind of approach it. So I think I will be doing a few of these over time, over the year as well, and beyond, because I feel like everything that, I'll find new ways to make certain sounds and I'll have new processes and therefore I'll be able to share those with you. This process is how I go about it right this moment. I just want to preface this by saying I'm not the best sound designer in the world. I do have my own certain ways of doing things, but I know that other people are going to be doing things a little bit differently. My personal preference about sound designing is a lot to do with trial and error and happy accidents and resampling. I really, really enjoy that process. It has become more intuitive for me. I don't like going into a project, into a drop or something that I need to make, and having to try and put out what's in my head into a synth and make it sound a certain way. I'm just not really that good at that, at least just yet. So what I tend to do instead is do sound design sessions, make all these weird and wacky sounds separately. And then when I come to make a drop, I have all of these sounds that are there, to be able to fill certain purposes that I may need during the creative process. So the way that I want to get into it now is to show you something that was really, really useful for me a while back. It is actually called the Neurobase theory, and it's a chart here. If we have a look, I'll bring it up just here. And it basically covers a step-by-step process of approaching sound design, which has been really, really helpful for me because it means that I'm not kind of guessing where I should go and how I should start. It's meant that there is a sort of certain formula to it to a degree in which I can then personalize to my own needs. But it just takes away a lot of the guesswork in terms of where I should start and what kind of process I should take. So if we look into this right now, it starts off as a source waveform, which is clean, full, and harmonically rich. This is a really interesting and a really sort of good point to be made, because the cleaner the initial source sound is, the better the better and cleaner the sound comes out at the end, and the more moving room we have with, say, post-processing and comb filtering and like reverb filtering and all those sorts of things. It sounds cleaner and better with a source waveform that's nice and clean. I will also quickly say that this is a Neurobase theory chart, which is specific to Neurobase, which I was really intrigued by and still am, but it has bled over into my normal sound design and even into things like leads and not just bass, and my approach to general sound designing. This kind of has helped quite a lot. So this is why I'm referencing this. Secondly, underneath that, we have detune and movement, which is talking about spread, unison, voices, FM, and more wavetable stuff. So this kind of talks about where in the stereo field it's sitting, how many voices we're going to be using, and adding harmonics like FM and changing the wavetable slightly in terms of modulation. So it's definitely like a more movement modulation type step, which we can then look into with LFOs and things like that by adding them to, adding harmonics through wavetables and through FM synthesis. After that, we can look into this next section, which is all highlighted green, which sort of indicates that we can flip these around in any sort of way that we like. And it is kind of more personalized. It is a more personalized section. The way that we have it here at the moment is the filter movement. So that's the next section. We usually go by, it'll be the sort of band rejects and notch boosts and low passes and high passes and resonances and playing with those sorts of things. We're trying to look into like this step and the step before. We're looking into the actual kind of like shape of the sound. That's kind of like a big step in trying to figure out what we're doing. And the way that I do it, I have a few different sort of like when I pull out my MIDI notes that I want to use. When I'll show you in this a bit later, when I pull out the MIDI notes that I want to use, I make them different sizes and lengths to fill different purposes, I suppose. So one will be like really short one shots. There'll be really next be ones that sort of are about the size of a beat, and then there'll be really long ones that we can really start to get sort of flowy and evolve over. Secondly, we look into this frequency separation. I don't tend to do this too much. I do have a clean sub though. I always have my subs separated. I might separate the mids and the highs potentially, but I don't tend to do that too often. So this is an example of how I sort of have personalized this process is by, I don't tend to do this frequency separation too much, but that's not to say that you can't. After that, we have distortion, so things like saturators, wave shapers, amplifiers. That's when we can start to add in other harmonics and make the distortion move with the certain filter movements that we've added in prior to the distortion. Next is a little bit of a fiddly one, and this is the effects in space. This is where the reverb comes into it, and the chorus effects and the phaser effects, and even the comb filtering. I tend to do these sorts of effects afterwards, like the reverbs and the chorus and phasering and all that stuff. But at the same time, I do incorporate it inside, but I don't do it as a stereo effect and a space effect. I just kind of have it as like a more of an effectsy type thing. So after that, we have it as a resample. So we're going to be recording all of this into a audio file, basically, and then we can either redo all of the steps prior. As you can see in this green section here, we can go back and do filter movements and frequency separation, distortion, etc. Or we can stick with the sound that we have, or we can put it in a sampler and start playing with it there. But there are so many different options that we have here, but this is kind of a basic layout. The way that I kind of like work with this is by having a bunch of MIDI notes, having Serum, making a patch, having all of these modulators going on, and then recording, like having a loop going, recording the loop, and then I will play with knobs and LFOs and all these different effects during the recording process, so that at the end, say after like 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, I have this huge long audio file in which I can then chop out different interesting sounding audio from what we've made there. The reason why I like doing this as well is because a lot of the time I will have all of these happy accidents in terms of I will make sounds in there that I wouldn't have made if I was trying to make a certain sound. That may come from an experience, that may come because I should have more sound design experience. Maybe when I do eventually, I will be able to be more specific with this, but there have been so many times where I have turned knobs and cranked things and I've been like, that's freaking awesome. I wouldn't have done that conventionally. And so that's where we are now. So I won't try to ramble too much because I think this is going to be a little bit of a lengthy episode. I'm going to close this down now and we won't reference it anymore because I'm going to kind of get more into the way that I do it. But that is a really, really good reference to have a look at. So essentially, to start off with, I'm going to make a MIDI patch, a MIDI track and an audio track. In the MIDI track, what I'm going to do is throw in some MIDI notes. Now, it is good to make these patches or these sounds around the tempo that we're going to be working in or that you often work in. So if you're doing like a lot of dubstep, 150. If you're doing a lot of mid-tempo, say 90 to 100. If you're doing drum and bass, say 174 or 87. That just means that you won't have to do as much warping when the time comes. So I'm going to stick to 150 for now, just sort of stick to this dubstep sort of sound. That doesn't mean that we can't use them in those other genres at all. That doesn't mean anything like that. Because then what we're going to do is start to throw in these MIDI notes. We're going to choose a key that I use often, which will usually be between D and F. So I'm going to throw it in, say, E. First length I'm going to do is going to be like the initial sort of hit one-shot thing that we have at say the start of a drop. So it's like, well, so that like one beat length. So that'll be that one. So what I'm going to do is duplicate that. So there's two of them. There's a little bit of a gap in between each one. Next, I'm going to make ones that are half the size, again with a little bit of a gap. Next, I'm going to make ones that are a bit longer, a little bit of a gap again. Then I'm going to make ones that are really short. Then I'm going to make one that's extra long. So what this is going to do is the reason why I want to make all these different lengths, and especially these long ones, is because we're going to get different enunciations out of each of them. The patch is going to sort of react differently to the shorter lengths and the longer lengths. And the reason why the long one's really good is because when it does get down to audio, we have a sort of longer piece of audio to kind of work with when we're trying to choose or work with a part of the sound inside, like I say, a new drop. I like to use them as a layering tool. So if I have like the one sound that's like, the one that I really like, and I want to make more of a stereo effect, what I can do is duplicate that sound and move that sound across to, say, the other half of the sound. So it's got the same timbre, but it's not identical. So it's not having these weird detuning, phasey effects. So I can then move one left, one right, have the same sort of timbre going across the board, and then we can have this really wide, nice stereo effect that still sounds really cohesive. That is just my philosophy and theory. It's the way that I work. I don't know whether other people do that, but it's the way that I kind of have fallen into. What we're going to do then is chuck a serum on there. We're going to be using serum today. I will be doing one with, say, Vital and Phase Plan at some point in time, but I'm really comfortable with serum doing this because that's usually what I do. So we're going to stick with that for now. Or we can also do this. You don't have to do this, but I enjoy putting on a bunch of processing. Or the other way to do it is to have it so it's not on. You can put the processing on later. It doesn't really matter what you end up doing because you'll get two different effects, and I think it's great to do both. But this is what we're going to do today because it gets really exciting, and it gets a really exciting sound straight away, and it makes you kind of feel vibed straight away. Okay, so this rack itself, just to run through it for you guys, is pretty much just a beef up rack, makes things sound nice and fat. There isn't anything too crazy going on. We can do a tutorial of just making racks one day. But I think this is something that's really, really useful for people to go and do by themselves. You can go and copy this if you want. But I think it's more beneficial for you guys to go and do that. Maybe I can make a rack and I'll make it available for you inside the Patreon. And so then you can go and make your own versions. But the sort of setup that we've got inside this rack is heavy guitar tube, got a little bit of a reverb. And the reason why I put reverb before all the processing is that you do a really short reverb and then be able to modulate or sort of change the macro. What am I trying to say here? I want to macro the dry wet to have a really short decay time, because if you do that before a bunch of processing, what happens is it kind of makes the reverb flare out like crazy. So if you can have control over that, that's really, really cool. You can get some interesting effects that way. After that, we've got a bunch of OTTs, a bunch of saturators, overdrive, all that sort of stuff. The OTTs amounts are all macroed back to an OTT back here. Saturator amount, dry wets are all macroed back to a saturator knob back here. They're on hard and medium curves. I don't tend to have the drive macro because I think that the dry wet does enough, especially when it's on medium and hard curve. We've got an overdrive, which is on like 9%. It's not doing a whole lot. Another OTT, saturator. I've got an EQ8 here. Not sure why this is on mid-side mode. We can just have that on stereo, to be honest. We have a Haas effect, which makes things really fucking obnoxiously wide. I used to do this a lot with the mid-tempo stuff that I was making. After that, we've got a flanger and a phaser. Both the dry wets are linked back to a macro at the start here as well to get some interesting sort of stereo effects. I've got another saturator. Got a vocoder on enhance and modulator. The format's up slightly. We've got precise on. We've got 20 bands. Dry wet is pulled back to a macro at the start. Makes things sound a little bit more like squared off and quantized. So you get some interesting effects that way as well. And then we've got another OTT and a sausage fattener, which the fatness is macroed back to the start here as well. So that's the general idea of the rack that we've got going on. I just want that. I'm going to turn that down. There we go. So we're going to be working into this, which would be kind of fun. So if we get stuck into the actual sound, let's go through and sort of have a talk about what we kind of go and look for here. So sound design to me is trying to find like sweet spots, basically. That's kind of like what has made it really, really easy for me. Not easy, but like makes approaching it a lot easier. We're going to be looking for sweet spots, and we're going to be following some sort of formula here. So we're going to start off with a wavetable. I like using one that doesn't have too much going on in it, so we can roll through this and sort of have a play and see what's going on. Also, one thing to note is we want to make sure that the octave of the MIDI notes is the right octave. So we don't want to make it too low. We don't want to make it too high. We want to make it in this, usually around this E0 sort of octave. If you listen to it when it gets up nice and high, you don't want it that high. Those are a little low and flumpy. That's the kind of sweet spot that you want there. It's usually around the E0. So be mindful of that for sure. We can do a couple of like, actually, you know what we're going to do as well? Just for fun. It's going to lengthen this out. I'm going to make another long one. Shorten that up a little bit. And I'm going to give it another octave higher. Just to have these little like surprises now and then. And what I'm going to do is make it mono and legato, pull the glide time up a little bit. Cool. So there's an interesting little bit in here. I don't love that sound, but in there sounds kind of like flumpy and nice. What I'm going to do is actually put my headphones on for this so that I can really hear what's going on. All right. So we're going to choose a wavetable, which is the first idea here. So I'm going to choose this one for now. We want to have a look at the voices next. Usually what I do is I make this easy. We're going to stick with one. The reason why is because it usually makes it a lot cleaner. If I start going into 2s and 3s and 4s, starts winding things out, detuning things, and causing potential phasing effects. I did this really on when I first started doing this sort of process, and I came out with some not super desirable results. I kept using the old stuff that I was making. I was like, this isn't as kind of powerful as the ones that I'm making now. So I usually keep it down to 1 and then make my stereo effects later on in the piece. So we're going to keep it at 1 for now. We're going to keep the random on. It doesn't really matter about that when we just have the 1 unison going on. So I find that there's like a bit of a sweet spot in there. So what we're going to do is grab we're going to start modulating. So we're going to grab an LFO. We can make whatever. I'm going to change this throughout the recording process as well. We can make like, this is kind of like your sort of typical growl sound, like growl movement. We're just trying to like figure out, when it comes to sound designing, we want to try to figure out what the movement is going to be in terms of like, if you're trying to make something specific. In this case, it's not so much applicable because I'm not sort of trying to make something specific, but it is interesting. It is good to know what will make certain sounds. So in your head, how is that sound going to sort of process? Is it going to be like a quick whap sort of thing? Is it going to be like a growl? So it's like a wow. Is it going to be like a more long drawn out sort of sound? So if I'm looking to make this like wow, wow sort of sound, that's kind of like typical growly sort of motion, I'm going to make something that looks like this little wave. And then I'm going to modulate. So if anyone doesn't know Serum or doesn't like sort of understand these, we're going to go and grab this LFO. I'm just going to click it, drag it and put it on the WT, which is the wavetable position. And then we're going to just sort of like grab this little circle thing, this blue circle here, and move the amount, I suppose, of the LFO around until we find like a really nice sort of sweet spot where it peaks at a really nice time and it peaks at a really nice position in the wavetable and then comes back down. So it almost sounds like it's opening up and closing. So you can hear when it starts, that this point here is when it sort of starts to open up, and you kind of want to take advantage of that. So you can hear when it starts. You can hear what happens when we slightly move these bands around as well. So at the moment, all we've done is just make an LFO and put it on the wavetable position onto a wavetable itself. That's kind of where we're at right now. Nice and easy. We're already getting sort of this movement from it. And secondly, we can go and start making some filter movements, or we can start oscillating an FM synthesizer, or FM synthesis, sorry. And the way we do that is by turning on oscillator B, going into this these warp modes, going into FM. Oh, sorry, we're going to go from here. FM from B, and then we're going to make sure that the level of this one is down because you don't want to hear it. This is actually just going to reroute itself back into here and cause an effect. So as you can hear, it's taking an effect already. We can then modulate that if we want to. Usually where we're going to sit with the FM is around this sort of area. When you get too far up, it starts to go a little bit too wacky. So what we're going to also have a look at is the wavetable that we're using to frequency modulate this. And if we go and have a look at, say, a basic one, and also what we can do is start to modulate the bend minus. It gives us another little bit of an option. Start to modulate the wavetable position if we wanted to. All right, so we can start to have a look at this frequency, this filter modulation. What we can do is you can kind of have a play with a lot of these different ones. If you're looking to make just like a sort of typical growl sound, have a look at going with the high pass filters, modulating that. What we're looking for here is to modulate this cutoff so it's mainly around this low mid section. We're going to also crank up this resonant parameter. And we're looking to make this a little bit vowely. So if you have a listen, I'm going to turn this resonance down. It doesn't sound too vowely when we just have it that way. But if we start to crank this resonance up, all of a sudden it starts to get wowy, right? So what we're trying to do is try to find a nice little sweet spot where this sits really nicely with the sound. That's a little bit too high, unless you're into that thing. So that's kind of playing with that valley resonance sort of sound. So there's this annoying little kind of sound at the end of this that I'm not enjoying, and I'm pretty sure it's from this FM synthesis. So that's kind of cool, really like straight and valley and pretty heavy. So that's fun. And you can also have a play with a bunch of other ones like the multis. It's like a bandpass and notch. again, what we've got here is we've got a cutoff, which is sort of doing the bandpass node, and then we've also got a notch here, which is this frequency. So if we can make these work together, this could be really cool to make it extra vowely. Modulate this frequency too. Also, one thing I forgot to mention is we want to make sure that we're on trigger, not off, with the LFO, because then it'll start back around each time the MIDI note hits. Bit of a cleaner sound, bit nicer for me to want to work with. So I'm just going to leave it there for now. I don't think we talked about, I think I talked a whole lot about sub stuff after the video cut out, but there is something to note as well when we go and play with our subs. Usually what I do is I have the sub as a separate track. The reason being is because then I have a lot more control when I'm like mixing, and it also gives me a much cleaner result. Means I can level the sub as much as I want to, or as little as I want to, and I can properly get it in the mix to make it a nice solid foundation, which I'll do, we probably have done a video on already. So I usually do that separately, but it is something to note that when we do play with a sub, especially inside a sound design session, that low frequencies do tend to affect things like saturators pretty heavily, in terms of if you design a sound that doesn't have any low end frequency in it, and then you feed that into a saturator, it's going to end up having this kind of weird white noisy sort of like not super desirable crushy sound most of the time. But if we say put a sub through it, that's going to affect the distortion a little bit more differently and a bit more heavily, and therefore giving us a bit more of a nicer rounded, more crunchy sound. So it is something to kind of keep in mind. In this, we can have a play with how the sub sounds. But I tend to like the way it sounds without, to be honest, because we're going to do it, if we were to do the sub, we do it directly out so it doesn't get affected by this high pass filter. It doesn't sound horrible at all without the sub on, so that's why we've been working. So I think it's going to be okay. Let's play with it on anyway. Doesn't tend to make too much of a difference really at this point in time, so I'm going to leave it off for now. Yeah, I'm okay with that off, so we're going to leave that. Not sure if I mentioned before, but we want to make sure with the LFO that we're going to have it on trigger, not off. Then we're going to get into the effects section. So once all this is done, this is all malleable. I want to stress the fact that we can change this, and we will change this throughout the recording process. So when we actually get to the recording process, we can change all these parameters and knobs. This is all stuff that we can take advantage of but we're just trying to get like a ballpark figure and ballpark idea for this right now. So before we move on to the effects section, which is now. So what we can have a look at here with Serum, as you probably all know, with the hyperdimension all the way down to filter. If we play with hyperdimension, I don't tend to do that too often, especially the dimension part. Sometimes I will modulate the mix of the hyper, which is kind of fun. But the reason why I don't tend to do it too much is potential phase issues again. What happens is you've got the source sound that we've just made coming into this module, getting split into four identical sounds, then getting detuned, and then coming out the other end, slightly different in tune with potential phasing effects. This could be speculation, but I tend to get cleaner results when I want to layer and do all that kind of stuff when I just have it as one unison sound. So, but if we have a listen here, we can modulate it so that the start of the sound is completely mono, and then, or not completely mono, but the start of the sound is one voice and then branches out into four. I like modulating the mix of a lot of these effects for that reason. So that's kind of cool. I won't do that with the dimension because I just don't love the sound, especially that weird sort of artifact at the end. We can play with the distortion should we want to. Keep in mind when you're sound designing that the order of which you have your modules, of which you have your processes of your OTTs and your compressions and all that sort of stuff will matter in terms of how it sounds. So if we have a look at what we've got here, we've got a distortion after the hyperdimension, meaning that the distortion is going to distort the hyper and the dimension part of the sound. So that means that these kind of weird detuning bits that we all of a sudden have are going to be distorted in interesting sort of ways. So that can be desirable. Sometimes it can't. You can hear at the end of this sound that there is a little bit of an extra artifact that we didn't have before. Right? Kind of cool. I don't mind it. Something to keep in mind. Kind of cool. So then we got things like flanger and phaser and chorus and delays. We can then modulate the mix of these as well, which is kind of fun. So we can put the mix all the way down, push this all the way up, or not all the way up, push this up a little bit so that when the LFO happens, it kind of slowly opens up. Giving an extra sort of stereo effect. Does give you a really phasery sort of sound though. Do that with the phaser as well, should we wish to. Play with the frequency. What I like to do is pull up the mix sometimes so that I can really hear the effect of the things that are happening down here. So these are pretty subtle, nothing too crazy just yet. Chorus is always going to be interesting too. Good thing to note that this LPF is a low pass filter. So if you want to have the chorus effect be fully open as opposed to filtered off, you've got to make sure that this is open. So for example, we put this before the distortion. It means the chorus effect is going to be pushed right up into the front of the mix with everything else. So it kind of, this sort of stuff is going to take away focus from the sound. So it's not really something that I like to do too often, because with this, I want to make it as sort of clean as I can, but we can definitely add little subtle bits of this in here and there. Delay I don't tend to use too often. Compressor is going to be like, it'll be the multiband, which is going to be pretty much the OTT, which I don't need because I've got a bunch of OTTs in my chunk rack. Also, I don't love the OTT sound with Serum because I think the way that it does this is it does it in a parallel way as opposed to the Ableton one, which does it as like an amount. And what that means is that the compressor here is going to be adding, it's going to have this, it sounds like it has the original sound with another sound coming up through it, which is causing it to phase out. So if you can hear, it's either going to be at 100% or 0%. I think. Yeah, if you have it at 50%, it kind of gets this weird phasey thin sound. It's either got to be one or the other. As soon as you start mixing it in, you've got this odd kind of like, yeah, phase out thin sound, which I'm just not about. So don't tend to use that. I'll just use the Ableton version. Next, we've got the reverb, which we can mix in the LFO on the, sorry, mix the LFO in on the mix. There you go. Should we want to, but the way that I would do that actually is by removing that and putting the envelope on the mix, because then what happens is when the MIDI is on, the reverb is on, but when the MIDI turns off, the reverb is also completely off. So that's what happens with this envelope, which is also our amplitude. But because of the trunk rack, it's going to be bringing out these artifacts after it regardless, because it's so heavily processed. So this is where these cool tails come into it. So if I put this on resampling mode real quick, you'll be able to see what happens. So all of a sudden we have this cool little artifact, which we can then resample and then do a bunch of shit with. We can add another fucking trunk rack on there if we want. We can use this as different types of reverses. We can use these as tails. This is a cool little distorter section. We can use this like a glitch or something. We can do lots of cool stuff with these types of tails. So it's something to be aware of. We can play with that during the recording process, but if I kind of want to have that off because it's a little bit cleaner. Then we've got an EQ, which we can also start to play with the sort of more valley sounds again. So chuck the LFO on the frequency, put that on low pass, and what we have here is going to be like another kind of accentuated version of this that we have here, because we've got all this processing happening here. We're just kind of like redoing this section here. Kind of cleaning it up like a little bit. We can also do the same thing with the notch here. Maybe have them like cross over and meet. Like hello. Don't think it's super necessary in this, but it sounds all right. I think we can get away with it. Then we have the filter section, the filter module, which is also a lot of fun because we can then go into this miscellaneous section, which I like doing at the end here. And it's got all these really interesting filters. So what we can do is say chuck on like a Combs filter, a reverb filter, any of these, really crank up the resonances, and see what kind of weird wacky effects we can get, because this is where it kind of gets a little bit fun. So for example, with the Combs effect, what I like to do is make sure that the resonance is all the way up, the damp is all the way up, because if you listen to the resonance without the damp on, it sounds like a fucking mess. Damp on, we've got rid of all of those extra artifacts and the tails and all the reverb shit going on. So there's that. Now we can start to affect the cutoff. Get these really cool sort of lasery wappy effects. That's a Combs filter. You can go and look at other ones like reverb. Again, pretty wappy sounds. Haven't played with the drive too much, but that gives it a really interesting effect. It kind of like makes it really sort of wappy in stereo. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm going to be playing with throughout the recording process. But now that we have this kind of like main sound, we can start getting start doing the fun stuff and get recording. So like I said before, we've got our trunk rack already set up, so we don't need to do any like extra post processing. But and like we kind of went through it before, so we just want to be beefing up the sound a lot. We can really get into this and do like a whole rack section at some point in time. But we're going to stick with this for now. I can put this in the, maybe I'll give this away. I haven't decided yet, but we'll do that. We'll have a look. We'll have a look. But so what we can do now is turn the resampling track back on. We can turn it to resampling like I talked about before. I'm just going to do that again for you guys so we can clarify it. We're going to make a new track with Control or Command T. We're going to go to external in, this one at the top, and go to resampling. And then I'm going to arm it by turning on this little red dot right there. I'm just going to make sure that's still recording. Yeah. And then we're good to go. So I've got my recording hotkey set to period or full stop. You can just press this one up here. Right, there's that there. But I just press one there. And then what we're going to do is that's going to continue recording. Make sure that this is on loop. So Command L or click this one up here. Make sure that MIDI is on loop because that's just going to keep going round and round and round and round while we're recording until we press stop. And then we're going to make sure that Serum is up so we have control over that. So if we click on this one, click record, we're going to get going and we're going to start playing with some parameters and get some fucking weird sounds going on. Okay, so my ears are about blown off, and we've got a pretty decent sort of idea and sound of what's going on here now. So we've just done a whole humongous sort of session there of just making fucking sounds, right? So what we can do then is pull this out from this end, and we're gonna have a humongous fucking audio file under our belts here. As you can see, I'm just going to turn this off for now. Cool. So there we have a whole sound design session of us just making ridiculous, wacky sounds, which we are then going to have a play with. So what we can do now, chop out the sounds that we like, label them, and export them. Now, the easiest way to do that is to name the whole thing. So what I like to do is have a similar name through my like whole sort of folder. So everything starts with BLNK. And then we're going to figure out something to label this specific session. Let's go succulent. Not that you can see that. There's a succulent here. So suck. And then we're going to start labeling numbers. So 01. Now, one thing we should do as well is also label the key, which is E. We can label the BPM as well, should we wish. We can go 150, but that's kind of whatever. Now that the whole thing is labeled, when we chop it up, each chop is going to have that in there. So all we have to do is go in and change the number. So I'm going to actually do it this way. So it's E and then 150 and then 10, so that when I go and rename something, I can just put in at the very end there. Yeah, so there's that one. And then what we're going to be doing is going through and choosing which bits we like. So the way that we rename stuff, by the way, is Command R, nice and easy. The way that we cut things up is Command E, like that. And because this is all in the same BPM, it's going to be nice and easy to sort of chop up. So there's a nice, like, kind of teary sound, so we can just do that. Now what we're going to do, we can just chop that up. So I've gone Command E. What we do then now is relabel it if we were going to, but we don't need to because it's the first one. And then we're going to consolidate it. And the way we do that is with Command J. If you go in here, you can go to consolidate somewhere here. I don't do it anymore, so I don't even know where it is. Consolidate, there we go, Control J. Mine's different because I've got a Mac keyboard thing. So we go Control J. Boom, done. Now that's done. What we're going to do then, once we've gone through and done all of these, we can go into right click and show an Explorer. It's going to pop up in your little Explorer folder here. And then what we're going to do is you're going to make a folder full of all your sounds that you can put in. I've got blank sounds. We're just going to drag that in somewhere in your computer, which would be, for me, it would be in here. And I just go to blank sounds again, copy that and drag it into that. And then what would happen is it would pop up in this little folder here, and we'd be good to go to use them whenever we like. So we're going to go through quickly and chop these all out. So if we go chop that, Control R, number 2, Control J, rock and roll, that one's done. So I'm not going to do every single sound. What we're doing is trying to find bits and pieces that we really, really like. This can become a bit of a tedious process in itself, so just be wary of that. Those are kind of cool though, so that can almost act as like a little percussion sound, which is kind of fun. So and that's a cool little Foley section as well. So just got to remember, the hardest part for me now is remembering what number I was up to. Label that 03. So if we play that separately, try and think of this outside of context of like it being a huge audio sample and just being this itself. So it's got a cool like percussive sort of element to it. So I'm going to label that 4, Control J, and move right along. These are a little bit more wappy, so I kind of wouldn't mind hanging on to these and actually even grabbing the tail. It's a bit lasery and wappy, which I kind of like. So I'm going to rename that 5, I think I was up to. Control J that. That's kind of cool. As like a pre-lead up thing. Kind of cool. So basically what I'm trying to do is just like think of how many different ways we could use these sorts of random sounds. Let's just go 6 with that one. Got some cool little like lasery wap things. You can cut that out. Leave that as a whole. And then what was that going to be? 7, I think. Can J that. More lasery waps, which I should probably label them as laser waps. LZR is what I use my lasers as. What I label my lasers. Label my lasers. Double laser 9. Gonna LZ ZR that as well. That's a bass noise. One thing to do is make sure you monitor nice and low with this, because it kind of gets out of fucking hand if you don't. Your ears are gonna hate you if you don't monitor low. So just be wary when you're doing this as well. That's cool. I like that. Relabel that. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh shit. So this is kind of cool. This is one thing that's really interesting about doing these sorts of sessions, is that we can chop that and use this as potentially like some sort of, I don't know, like a lead almost. So you can layer this with something, because it's got a really interesting kind of vocally like vowel-y tone to it. So I'm just going to label that as 14. So this is what I like, really like about this, is I can pick bits and pieces out of the sound. Same thing with this. I kind of really like these sorts of tones, because I can use them for like glitch sorts of sounds. This is interesting. I don't know what the hell this is. Let's pull that down though. And let's consolidate that. Because that's, I don't know, there's got something interesting to it. Again, this can be like used as a freaking tom drum or a percussion or anything like that. The amount of kicks that I find in here is also really cool, like this. Like, what the hell is that about? That's awesome. Again, this is like another little tom drum thing. Literally a kick. Cool stereo effects there. So that's something to do. That's kind of funny. Just a kind of obnoxious bass sound. We're going to go with that with 20. I kind of like this as like a glitch sound. Let's resample that again. Look at that fucking waveform. Ridiculous. I love it. Do kind of like that the way it is. So I'm going to like do a 21 for that one. And then I'm going to do this one as 22. BLNK. Suck. E150. 22. That's croaky. That's going to be 23. We are halfway through, folks. That's kind of cool. What I'm going to do is label that as... I'm going to label that as glitch. So I've got all my glitch sounds as glitch art. Why that was a glitch sound, I couldn't tell you. I'm actually not sure. It's more melodic than glitchy. That's kind of cool. That's a little glitchy sound, so maybe that can be a glitch art thing too. $88. Yeah. I'm sure someone could use these. But I don't like them. So the thing about this kind of stuff, it's like you never know what's going to actually sound any good in context. So it's kind of like, do I grab these or do I not grab these? Sounds like Daffy Duck. I kind of like these flappy waps. So stuff like that you kind of get used to listening out for. I've forgotten what number I'm fucking up to, maybe 26. That's a cool little glitch as well. The reason why I'm pulling them down is so I can listen to them in like out of context. So they're just like by themselves. And I'll be like, wonder if that's like a glitch that I'd actually like to listen to. Whoops. Literally have no idea anymore. It's a kind of cool sound. 29. This is where I cranked up the OTT and stuff, so I think it's going to sound a bit cooler now. So that'll be really cool to use. So this will be a 31, 32, whatever it is. So the reason why I do these long ones again is because I can use that whole section if I want to like layer things up. I can do this one left. I can do this one right. Let me just mute these for a second. I can pull these down like this. And then I can have it so it's like, say it's just this like one section here that we want. I can shorten these both down to be that long, and I can go do the Command Option Shift thing and then move each of these along, and then all of a sudden I've got this more stereo wide sound from this sort of more mono sound. That's quite like centered, which is great because I want that because it cuts through the mix really well. And then I've got these, which are from the same sound, but just moved across slightly. So there shouldn't be any phasing issues necessarily with anything going on here, but each sound is going to be slightly different. So like I've sort of mentioned before, I think the whole stereo phenomenon comes from your ears hearing two different sounds at the same time. So what's happening here is we've got one sound, we've got another sound that's slightly different. And the reason why it sounds stereo is because one ear is hearing something different to the other ear. And the reason why this is good is because it's kept in the same timbre, it's the same sound, it's from the same sound, it's from the same MIDI note. But all we've done is just move them along slightly so that each sound that you hear is slightly different to the next. So then it creates this kind of stereo image. So I'm going to grab these. Again, I like those kinds of sounds because they're really good for sort of wee barp, wee barp. 35. So again, just want to stress making sure that you're kind of like listening to the sound on its own. It does help sort of you make a better decision about whether or not you like the sound or not. So this one's kind of fun. Ridiculous sort of glitchy sounds, so I can put that as a glitch art one. It's an interesting sound, so I'm going to steal that too. Cool. So it looks like we've gone through and done the entire thing, which is a bit of a tedious process. We've got there in the end, but now we have like 40 to 50 new sounds that we can end up using in our productions and our creations. So that is generally how I would go about making the sounds. Now, what we would do then, like I said before, we would go in and just to find where these would sit, we go and show an Explorer, and the whole thing's going to show up here. And basically, it's going to be inside your projects folder, inside the samples folder, inside the process, and then consolidate folder. It kind of shows you here. So all of these new different sounds are in here, good to go. So we can then click all of these and drag them into your sounds folder that you've now created, that you can now keep adding to. And then it's going to show up in your, if you put it as a quick link here, as a quick folder, access folder, you can then access it. Right? So rock and roll. I'm not going to take up too much more time because I think that is like the main sort of grounding and basis of my sort of sound design process. From there, I'm going to use those and use them in different like creations and projects, etc. So I hope that helped, guys. Let me know if you have any questions, as always. And I will see you guys in the next video.